All right, get ready, because we are diving deep into the world of craniofacial anomalies today.
Ooh, craniofacial anomalies. Sounds complicated.
It does sound complicated, right? But trust me, it's fascinating stuff. Basically, we're talking about those unique facial features that happen because of variations in, how our skulls and faces develop.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So, why should we care about these anomalies?
Well, for starters, they give us this incredible peek into the world of genetics, how things develop before we're even born, and, get this, even evolution.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. It's all connected.
Exactly. And you might be surprised to learn that some of these conditions are more common than you think.
Really? So, where are we starting this deep dive?
We're turning to a fantastic lecture by Mental Dental.
Oh, I've heard of them. They're great at explaining complex medical stuff in a way that actually makes sense.
Right. They use these really memorable mnemonics, clear visuals. They even bring in things like architectural metaphors to make your brain really click.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What kind of architectural metaphors are we talking about?
Well, just wait until we get to Abert syndrome, and they bring in Byzantine architecture. It's wild.
All right, you win. Let's get into it. Where do we start?
So Mental Dental breaks down prenatal craniofacial development into 5 main stages. And we don't have to get bogged down in all the technical jargon, but just know that so much is happening in those first few weeks after conception. It's actually mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's like a perfectly choreographed dance, right? And even the slightest misstep can throw everything off.
And that's where these anomalies come into play. They often pop up because of disruptions during these critical stages, which just goes to show how delicate this whole developmental dance really is.
It's true. One tiny thing goes wrong and boom, a whole cascade of changes can happen. It's like that domino effect.
Yes. Or imagine a recipe gone wrong. And that actually brings us to the difference between a sequence and a syndrome, which Dental explains so well. A syndrome is like having all the wrong ingredients in your cake batter. It's a specific pattern of anomalies, and there's usually a single underlying cause, often something genetic, like Down syndrome, for instance, is caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, and that leads to a specific set of features.
Okay, so that's a syndrome. What about a sequence?
A sequence is more like that domino effect we were talking about. One anomaly happens, and then it's like a chain reaction. Pierre-Robin sequence is a great example of that. An underdeveloped lower jaw can actually push the tongue back,
Yeah.
and that can prevent the palate from closing properly.
Oh, wow. So it's like one thing leads to another.
Exactly. And believe it or not, we're just getting started.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASD, for short.
Right, FASD. So that's where alcohol comes in as a teratogen, something that disrupts fetal development, right?
Exactly. And one of the things you often see with FASD is something called midface deficiency. Basically, the middle part of the face doesn't develop as much as it should.
So how does that actually show up? Like, what does it look like?
Well, you might see a smooth philtrum, that little groove between the nose and the upper lip.
Yeah, I see.
It could be smooth, or the upper lip might be thin. The eye openings might even be smaller than usual.
And this is where dental health comes in too, right?
Absolutely. These facial features can often mean there might be some oral health issues. Kids with FASD might have smaller teeth, or their teeth erupt later than usual. There's even a higher chance of a cleft palate, which we're going to talk about more in a bit.
This is all starting to make sense now. But it's not just about the teeth and face, right?
Right. FASD can also affect a child's learning and development, even how they speak. It's a good reminder that everything is connected.
It really is. So what's next on our craniofacial anomalies tour?
Okay, let's switch gears to something with a different cause, Treacher-Collins syndrome. This one stems from a genetic mutation.
Okay, so with Treacher-Collins, we're talking about genes, not alcohol exposure.
Exactly. And with Treacher-Collins, we can see how one tiny gene mutation can have this huge impact on how the face develops. The mutation affects these cells called neural crest cells. They're basically like the building blocks for a lot of the structures in the face, like bones and cartilage.
So they're like little construction workers.
Exactly. But imagine that instead of going to the right construction site, they get lost along the way. They take a detour.
Oh, no. So what happens then?
Well, that's when you start to see some of those characteristic facial features of Treacher-Collins. One of the big ones is a small, underdeveloped lower jaw. The technical term is mandibular hypoplasia. It's a mouthful, right?
It really is.
But basically, it just means the lower jaw didn't get the memo to grow properly.
So if the jaw doesn't develop like it should, what happens?
It can set off this whole chain reaction. You might see downward slanting eyes, underdeveloped cheekbones, and there's a higher chance of a cleft palate, too.
And those structural differences must make things really tough for breathing and eating and even just speaking clearly, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. It affects so many things. And this whole idea of developmental detours is key to understanding another condition, too. Hemifacial microsomia. It's like those neural crest cells, our little construction workers,
Yep.
have a bit of a sense of direction problem.
Hemifacial microsomia, so it affects half the face.
Exactly. It's like one side of the face didn't get the same instructions as the other. So you might see one side of the face is smaller or less developed, like the lower jaw might be smaller on one side, so it kind of shifts over.
So the face wouldn't be symmetrical.
Exactly. You often see something called microcia, too, which just means a smaller ear on the side that's affected.
Wow. It's amazing how these tiny little cells can have such a big impact.
It really is. And it just goes to show that even though we talk about all these conditions separately, they're often connected by these common threads, like how these neural crest cells migrate.
It's all about those connections.
Exactly. Okay, ready for a bit of a shift? Let's talk about a more common genetic condition, Down syndrome.
Okay, Down syndrome. So that's also caused by a genetic difference, right?
Yes. Down syndrome, which is also known as trisomy 21, happens when there's an extra copy of chromosome 21. And one of the things you often see with Down syndrome is upward slanting eyes. It's actually the opposite of what we see in Treacher-Collins syndrome.
Oh, you're right. It's like a mirror image.
Exactly. And just like with Treacher-Collins, we often see mid-face deficiency in Down syndrome. Now, here's a common myth. People often think Down syndrome means a higher risk of cavities, but thankfully, that's not totally true.
Oh, that's good to know. So no need to stock up on extra toothbrushes then.
Well, not necessarily. While the cavity risk might not be higher, there is an increased risk for periodontal disease. That's the stuff that affects the gums and the bones that support the teeth.
Okay, so it's still really important to pay attention to dental health.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that dental care is about way more than just brushing and flossing. You have to look at the whole picture.
You've got that right.
Speaking of how things develop, let's talk about another condition that can pop up because of disruptions during those crucial early stages. Cleft lip and palate. I remember Mental Dental used these really cool visuals to explain this one.
Oh, yeah. Their animations are great. They make it so much easier to understand how these structures are supposed to form and what can go wrong sometimes.
Right. So, to put it simply, a cleft happens when the tissues in the face don't fuse together the way they should early on in pregnancy. It's like a puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit.
I like that analogy. So it's like a puzzle piece that's a little bit off.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that while they can happen together, cleft lip and cleft palate are different. Cleft lip affects the upper lip, so it might look like there's a gap or an opening. Cleft palate affects the roof of the mouth.
Right, the palate is that roof of the mouth. So what happens with the cleft palate? Why doesn't it close up?
Remember when we were talking about those palatal shelves, the ones that are supposed to come together? Well, with the cleft palate, those shelves don't fuse properly, so there's this opening left in the roof of the mouth. And Mental Dental even talked about how important the tongue is in all of this.
The tongue? What does the tongue have to do with the palate?
It's wild. So during development, the tongue actually starts higher up, and then as the mouth grows, the tongue moves down. That gives those palatal shelves room to come together and fuse.
Oh, so the tongue gets out of the way.
Exactly. But if the tongue doesn't move down when it's supposed to, or if there's just not enough space in the mouth, it can get in the way and the shelves can't fuse properly.
Wow. It really is like a perfectly timed dance routine. It's all about timing, isn't it? And when we're talking about those perfectly timed developmental dances, Pierre Robin's sequence is a perfect example. Remember how we said sequences are like that domino effect?
Oh yeah, one thing leads to another.
Exactly. And with Pierre Robin's sequence, it all starts with a small lower jaw. The fancy term for that is micrognathia.
Micrognathia, got it.
So that small lower jaw, it's like the first domino to fall.
And because the jaw is underdeveloped, it pushes the tongue back, which then messes with how the palate develops.
You got it. The tongue gets pushed back into the throat, glossoptosis.
Glossoptosis, another mouthful.
Right. But anyway, having your tongue in the wrong spot, it can cause a few problems, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. Like, just swallowing would be hard, right?
Exactly. Babies with Pierre Robin sequence often have a hard time feeding because their tongue can actually block their airway. And because the tongue isn't where it's supposed to be, it can get in the way and prevent the palate from closing properly, which can lead to a cleft palate.
So the palate itself is fine, it's just that something else is getting in the way.
Exactly. It all comes back to that domino effect.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is during those early stages of development.
It really does. And speaking of development, we've been focusing a lot on the face, but what about the skull itself? Mental Dental also talks about cranial sutures. Had you heard of those before?
Cranial sutures. Honestly, not really.
They're actually pretty cool. They're those fibrous joints that connect the bones of the skull.
Oh, right. Like, so the skull can actually grow.
Exactly. A baby's head needs to be able to grow, and those sutures make that happen. But sometimes those sutures can fuse too early. That's called craniosynostosis.
Craniosynostosis. Okay, I'm starting to see why Mental Dental uses those metaphors.
Right. Well, they actually use a great one to explain Cruzon syndrome, which is a type of craniosynostosis. They compare it to a Roman arch.
Oh, yeah. That was a good one.
So think about the shape of a Roman arch. Perfectly symmetrical with that rounded top. Now imagine someone squeezing that arch from the sides.
Like squishing it.
Exactly. That's kind of what happens in Cruzon syndrome. The skull bones fuse prematurely, and it restricts how the skull can grow. So you end up with the shorter, wider head shape called brachycephaly.
Brachycephaly. So instead of that nice round shape, it's more like a...
Like a squished Roman arch.
Exactly. And that restricted skull growth that must affect the face too, right?
Absolutely. It often leads to mid-face deficiency, which seems to be a recurring theme with a lot of these conditions.
It does seem to pop up a lot.
And just like with the other conditions we've talked about, it can make things like breathing, eating, and speaking clearly a lot more challenging.
It's amazing how one thing can have such a ripple effect.
It really is. Now let's talk about another type of craniosynostosis, Apert syndrome. It has some things in common with Cruzon syndrome, like the mid-face deficiency, bulging eyes, a prominent forehead.
But there's some key differences too. That's where Mental Dental brings in those Byzantine arches, right?
They do, and it's a great way to remember the difference. So with Apert syndrome, instead of picturing a Roman arch, think about those high vaulted ceilings you see in Byzantine architecture. That's because people with Apert syndrome often have a high arched palate.
Oh, that's right. The palate is shaped like a Byzantine arch. I love how they use those visual cues.
They're so helpful. And another thing you often see with Apert syndrome is syndactyly. That's where the fingers and toes are fused together.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the skull and face that are affected.
Nope. It can affect other parts of the body too, and that's a really important thing to remember about genetic conditions. One gene mutation can have all these different effects.
It's like a chain reaction, but throughout the whole body.
Exactly. Okay, ready for two more syndromes? For these last two, we're going to talk about metabolic disorders, Hurler syndrome and Hunter syndrome.
I've heard of those, but I don't know much about them.
They're both rare genetic disorders that affect how the body breaks down certain complex sugars called glycosaminoglycans.
Glycosaminoglycans. Okay, you have to break that down for me.
Say that 3 times fast. But basically, they're these long chains of sugar molecules that are found all over the body. And they're super important. They help build connective tissues, lubricate joints, even regulate cell growth.
Wow, so they're involved in a lot.
They are. But with Hurler and Hunter syndromes, the body doesn't produce enough of the enzymes that are needed to break down those glycosaminoglycans.
So those sugar molecules just build up. That doesn't sound good.
It can cause a lot of problems depending on where those substances accumulate. And you might be wondering, how does this all relate back to craniofacial anomalies?
I was just thinking that.
Well, remember how I said glycosaminoglycans are important for connective tissues?
Right. And connective tissues are everywhere.
Exactly. So if those glycosaminoglycans build up, it can actually affect the skull and facial bones.
Oh, that makes sense. So even though these syndromes are caused by something different than the other ones we talked about, they can still lead to changes in the face.
You got it. And it shows just how interconnected everything in the body really is.
It's like a domino effect, but on a much bigger scale.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the whole picture, not just the individual symptoms.
It's amazing how all these conditions, genetic mutations, metabolic disorders, can end up affecting the face and skull. It really shows how connected everything is during development.
Absolutely. And we've only scratched the surface here. There are so many other craniofacial anomalies out there. Each one has its own unique challenges and ways to help.
That's true, but I think Mental Dental made a really good point at the end of their lecture. It's not enough to just memorize a bunch of conditions and what they look like.
Right. It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about understanding the why behind the what. Why do these things happen? How does everything develop? How does it all fit together?
Because when we understand the why, we can provide better care.
Exactly. We can diagnose earlier, know what complications to look out for, and create a treatment plan that actually makes sense for that specific person.
It's like having all the pieces of the puzzle instead of just a few.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots.